This is the Doing Business School Abroad podcast. I'm Ken Globerman, and if you're interested in going to business school somewhere out of your country, this is definitely the podcast series for you. Episode 5, the GRE Exam. Welcome back to our podcast series. This is Ken Globerman, the host and founder of No Brainer. Today, in this particular episode, we're going to talk about the GRE exam. Now, if you're following along so far, in the last episode, we talked about the application process, and we mentioned that part of it involves submitting a score to either the GMAT or GRE exam, which is part of the application process for the majority of business schools around the globe. So this particular episode is just going to talk a little bit about the GRE exam, because some schools do allow you to submit this exam score, even though the GMAT exam is is the more preferred exam in more business programs. But let's just touch upon the GRE right now. So the GRE stands for the Graduate Record Exam. It's administered by, it comes out of the U.S., and it's administered by an organization called the ETS, or the Educational Testing Service. And actually, the GRE is a general exam that is used by a variety of graduate school programs. So I would say that its genesis comes out of people applying to probably more PhD programs as opposed to business school. So if you're applying, for example, for a PhD program in education or a master's in education, or if you're going to a master's in social work program or psychology or English literature or many other degrees, degree granting programs at the graduate level, typically require the GRE, at least in the United States. And as I mentioned, now there are some business schools that will also allow you to use the score on this exam in their application process. So a little bit about the exam. It's offered. First of all, it's about a 3 to 4 hour test. So it's a long test. It's made up of 6 sections. And those sections are covering essentially a variety of math and verbal English comprehension subject matters. It's delivered both in the sort of standard paper, pencil, fill in the bubble sheet type format, and also now on a computer. But unlike the GMAT, which we'll talk about later, the order of the sections may vary, and which means you don't know if you're going to get a math section first or an English section first. And you can also skip around in questions, which is something you can't do on the GMAT exam. So what type of math might you see on the GRE exam? Generally, the GRE math, in my opinion, is a little easier than on the GMAT. I would say it's less analytical in nature. It's a bit more theoretical, and maybe it weights a little bit more towards kind of like statistics, since, again, this exam was really initially set up for people going into PhD programs, which is very research intensive. So the math was really kind of testing your graphical interpretation skills and sort of stats and whatnot. There's also, besides that, your basic kind of arithmetic properties. You need to know your basic operations, your obviously your addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but also dealing with exponents and roots and manipulating fractions and decimals and all kinds of fun stuff in math that we learn starting from when we're probably 7 or 8 years old in primary school. Beyond that, there is algebra. right? Which is usually something we learn in middle school or maybe in 9th or 10th grade in high school. And we also have geometry on the GRE exam. So you've got arithmetic, you've got algebra, you've got geometry, you've got, as I mentioned, a little bit of probability and statistics, and some other, let's say, data interpretation and set theory. Now, on the verbal side of the exam, let me mention one other thing unique about the GRE. The question types are of two. One is your sort of standard multiple choice question. You get a question, you get 5 answer choices to choose from. And the other type, which is unique to the GRE, is called quantitative comparison. So in quantitative comparison, you're kind of given a left side and a right side, and they could be different expressions of some sort. And the objective is to actually compare whether or not the left column is greater than the right column, or vice versa, or whether they're equal, or finally, if you can't tell based on the information provided. So that's something that's not on the GMAT exam, but is on the GRE. So it's something I wanted to bring up in this podcast. On the verbal side of the exam, I would say, in my opinion, GRE verbal is tougher than GMAT verbal. You often will get very dense reading passages that you need to be able to interpret quickly. So you have your sort of standard reading comprehension type of questions. And beyond that, you have a variety of different open-ended questions that will test your grammar skills, as well as your just general English language skills, in a way that the GMAT does not do. So I would say that if you have a choice between the GRE and the GMAT exam, if you're stronger linguistically and less strong mathematically, the GRE exam is definitely one that you'd want to consider. A couple of other things about the GRE exam: calculators are allowed for all the math sections. It's non-adaptive, and I'll explain more about adaptive tests in our next podcast episode. But what that means is basically everybody sees the same questions when you take the exam, right? The questions aren't changing dynamically based on whether you're getting them right or wrong. And finally, the paper test is delivered on fixed days of the years only, whereas the computer tests can be scheduled. Now, if you're outside of the United States, I believe that you only have the option of the computer test, the test that's served via computer. So the paper test is not even an option for you. But that's basically it. I mean, that's really all I wanted to really get across to you today. I don't want to dive too much into the GRE because it's not really the test that most people take for their business school application, but I did want to touch upon it. So in summary, the GRE exam is about the same length as the GMAT. It's set up in slightly more shorter sections. It's both testing your English comprehension and mathematics skills in slightly different ways. And the tests are actually administered by different organizations. The GRE is administered by something called the ETS, and we'll talk about in the next edition of the podcast series, the GMAT exam is administered by something called the GMAC. But which is a good segue. Our next episode will be about the GMAT exam. So let's talk about how the GRE is scored. The GRE exam has essentially 3 scores that are reported for you. The first 2 scores are the verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning scores. Each of those scores are reported on a 130 to 170 score scale. So what's a good score? Generally, about 150 to 152 is an average score on those sections. So if you want to get above average, obviously you want to get in the 150s. And if you want to get, let's say, a standout exceptional score, you want to get into the 160s. The third score is your analytical writing score. So one of the 6 sections you're going to complete is going to be an analytical writing passage. And that writing passage is scored on a 0 to 6 score scale in half-point increments. So an average analytical writing score is around 3.5. So a decent score would be around 4. A very good score would be sort of 4.5, 5 out of 6. So in short, that's the way the scoring goes. What score you need, of course, is going to be dependent on, again, like we mentioned earlier in the podcast series, it's a school-by-school thing, right? You need to know what the profile of the student body is at the schools you're applying to see how your score kind of how it looks versus the profile of the student body. So it's really something to be determined on a case-by-case basis. The next in our series is going to be about the GMAT exam, so definitely stay tuned. It's really important that you listen to that particular podcast. So I'm going to see you when you tune back in. For now, this is Ken Globerman signing off. Have a great day.